to produce internal work. And within 18 months of setting up, they moved from being the least awarded creative broadcaster to the most awarded, and produced a very memorable, John Lewis beating, in some people's opinion, Christmas ad for BBC One, and perhaps more importantly, massively improved the effectiveness of their marketing. So I think actually brands can in-house creativity, and that would be a good example of it working really well.
Thank you. Max, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jim that brands certainly do and can in-house creativity. I think what sort of gets overlooked in these conversations is that, you know, the role of an agency, an external agency, isn't just to hire good creative people and put them in a room, right? I mean, they do things that encourage positive outcomes, right? They create cultures and processes and workflows through things like recruiting and training and progressive HR policies and good brief writing and sort of respecting creative-led decision-making that encourages these outcomes. And I think that's sort of the place that more corporate environments are going to need to be able to focus if they want their internal agencies to be able to produce that kind of work. And the same goes for digital teams and production teams, right? Everybody, or all of these functions, sort of have their own sets of considerations that go beyond just staffing that I think are really important to think about and talk about, that factor into what is the cost of setting up an effective agency. It's not just labor and benefits. And this is why, you know, we're a big fan of mixed models, right? With some people on site and some off site, and even some on the offshore. I think that for us, we work with companies as an agency helping to figure out these models for our clients. And this is where sort of the right external partner can come in and be of assistance, not just from a staffing perspective, but also from a sort of cultural and process perspective. And certainly, you know, upstream creative work like the type that we're talking about can be a part of that.
Right, thank you. I mean, Jim, you mentioned the BBC, but obviously they are a creative entertainment organisation. So is it easier for a brand that's in that sector to staff up with 100 people, etc., and produce that? You know, the same for Channel 4, for example. Does it matter about the sector that the client works in?
I think that's a really interesting point, Tina, because on the face of it, you'd think that a creative organisation like the BBC would be able to set up an in-house agency and everything would work perfectly. But there is a bit of a tripwire, which is that in an organisation such as Channel 4 or BBC or any other creative organisation, there are hundreds of creative opinions. And when it comes to getting work signed off, that can actually be a bit of an Achilles heel. But it's a good point. And I think, to be fair, it might be interesting to share a different example, actually. And the one that comes to mind is Specsavers. So, you know, Should Have Gone to Specsavers is now, as everybody knows, part of the English language.
Yeah, love that work.
It's great work. It does that brilliant thing of entertaining consumers and customers, and in return they give their loyalty. I'm sure price comes into it as well. But you know, that work is written and produced from their base in Guernsey, and they've won a ton of creative awards and effectiveness awards, and actually have produced commercials for less than 20K. And when you think about it, how many opticians can you think of that have won a clutch of Cannes awards, or perhaps more importantly, that their creative has helped them achieve a market share that's twice that of their nearest competitor? So again, I think that's another example that perhaps disproves the theory that you can't in-house creativity. I'd just like to pick up on something that Max mentioned, if that's okay, just very briefly. I think Max mentioned culture, and I think that's a really important factor in in-house agencies. And it's the big thing that makes all the difference. And the watch out for people who are thinking about or who are running in-house agencies is that people the culture of the organization the agency is in can often be counter creative. So if you're, if you're working for a pharma business, for example, it's very scientific rather than being creative. So leaders of in-house agencies in the future, I hope, will understand the corporate culture and the effect it has on the in-house agency, and that they'll recognize the importance of establishing a subculture in the agency that's protected in the interest of more effective marketing.
Good question that's coming from Dan Foreman, saying that Specsavers is really the gold standard, which is true, isn't it? And what they're doing compared to all others, as you will show, is other in-house solutions don't always deliver that true difference, I suppose, from a creative point of view.
Yeah, I think they are the beacon, if you like, and I would say they're probably, well, as far as I know, that they're the kind of pioneer, really, because remember, they started 15, 20 years ago, 15 probably, and what they got right was bringing in a really skilled and experienced ECD, Executive Creative Director. But he's on record as saying it wasn't easy in the early days. And it took time to get used to working with an internal marketing department, who in turn were used to working with external agencies. So it takes time to establish.
Yeah.
But I'd say they do stand out.
Yeah, because Max, in the States, the impression I always got is much more prevalent in-house agencies. It's been much more established within the US market than perhaps in the UK and Europe.
I'm sorry, Tina, it broke up. Can you just ask the question again?
The impression I get is that it's much more prevalent in-house agencies in the US compared to the UK. So we're talking about Specsavers, Jim was saying that, been having in-house agencies for about 15 years, but when I go to sort of conferences in the States, for example, you hear a lot of brands that have had in-house agencies in the States for quite a long time. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think there's, we've done in-house agencies for 18 years in the US. So, I mean, quite a long time. I think, there was a period of time where production companies did on-sites inside of agencies, actually, and did a sort of mixed model that way on behalf of clients. And there's been models where, you just staff directly on-site inside of the client. And of course, there's been creative teams within marketing departments, especially in sort of the more direct-to-consumer spaces, whether that's e-commerce, or privately owned stores or wholly owned stores, when there's lots of sort of demand for quick turn materials and promotional content, sale content, the need to move fast. We've seen in-house agencies in these areas for a really long time.
Yeah, great, thank you. Taking the next question, there was another sort of contemporary view that in-house agencies are structured like an external agency, but their point of difference is cost, transparency, and that the work there is being produced. So is that true?
Shall I answer that, Tina?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think it's true that each in-house agency will have its own kind of diet of work, if you like, and that will shape the in-house team. But I think it's also true that the structures are often quite different to an external agency, partly because they're so close, they're located so close to the marketing department. And by way of an example, pretty much every external agency has a strategy team of account planners. And you probably couldn't say the same for all in-house agencies because marketing provides the strategic thinking. But having said that, I wonder if in-house agencies are missing a bit of a trick here, because what account planners do brilliantly is take a marketing brief and turn it into an inspiring creative brief, which is the kind of ignition, if you like, for really strong creative ideas. And so, for example, just going back to the BBC, their in-house team has a strategy team alongside creative. as well as having the strategic thinking in the marketing department. And it makes the whole process much more efficient and the output more effective. And of course, you know, if you add if you add efficiency and effectiveness, you usually get economy as a result. So there's that. And another difference perhaps is that external agencies tend to invest more in project managers.
Right.
Because they know that the way that projects are managed across the various agency functions has a direct and measurable effect on the quality of the output and internal efficiency. And often in in-house agencies, it's kind of, well, marketing can do that. And the kind of the watch out there really is that marketing people are often very brilliant marketers, but that doesn't necessarily make them a great PM, project manager, because it's a different set of skills, actually a different mindset. And marketing people tend not to have project management experience, although there are some exceptions, obviously.
Yeah. Max?
Can't hear you. I could add a key point to that just while we're waiting for Max. And that is that before you define your structure, that there are a couple of things you need to get in place first. Now, the blindingly obvious one is getting the right talent. But you also need to get the right operating system, if you like, or operations methodology in place to run the in-house agency. And when you put the people together with the methodology, that usually spells out what the structure should look like for you. Sure. And really, it's only once you've got those in place and you've worked out what your structure is, after that, that's the stage where you should start looking at the kind of technology that you use to run it. So it's a kind of step-by-step process. Otherwise, it tends to get the cart before the horse a little bit, and that's something that's come up a lot in our projects.
Yeah. Max, you sort of lost you a bit there.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm back. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, hear you fine.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's all right. But I've actually got quite a good question for you. It's coming from Kate. Thanks, Kate. To you, Max. What's your views for small advertisers and in housing? Obviously, especially at the moment, headcount is obviously under pressure, and obviously that's a challenge for a lot of clients. Do you differentiate creative work versus more production promotional activity, assuming something like strategy and planning may be sourced externally? So what's your view, Max, about how it works for small advertisers and in housing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, my view is that in-housing is appropriate for the kinds of works that have daily churn, right? If you are doing something every day, it could be, it doesn't have to be upstream creative concept work. It could be social content, CRM content, website management work, point of sale material, whatever it happens to be. Anything that has a sort of daily churn where you can keep utilization high of a staff, it makes sense to look at in-housing or at least on-siting some creative staff. I think that there is value to be had there. To Jim's point, as long as you're doing everything else from a structural perspective as well, from a technology workflow point of view, to a briefing point of view. There's quite a bit of work that an agency is doing to organize this effort from a marketing and brand team, or sometimes even an IT team. So you have to think about all of that and how it's going to get done, not just, think that you're going to add a designer and a copywriter and not add the project manager or not add the strategist, right? Like that's not reality. You're not going to get a good outcome that way. But yeah, if you have sufficient work to keep a team busy, it's worth talking about, regardless of the size.
Great, thank you. And Dan's just launched a poll on in-house agency. So great question. Does anyone have any in-house agency capability organisations? So if the people watching can vote. John Gleason's asked us quite a few questions. So really good one of the bit of a procurement slant is, obviously, when you set up an in-house agency, you're looking at sort of creativity and business driving responsibilities. But often when you get to years 3 and 4, perhaps one of the driving metrics becomes much more focused on productivity. So it's really how you manage that long-term relationship with an agency. And obviously, from a procurement point of view, we obviously got objectives as well as the sort of stakeholders. So I suppose it's what's your view about how that can be managed from a long-term perspective?
Shall I go first?
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Jim.
So productivity, I think, is the key point of your question. And that's actually a really relevant one, because one of the things about in-house agencies is that they can be perceived as free of charge.
Yeah.
So it's kind of all you need for free mentality sometimes in-house, because there isn't a hard cost associated with using the in-house agency. And what tends to happen then is that I'd say abuse is too strong a word, but certainly people don't, sometimes marketers or people who are briefing the internal agency don't put enough rigor into thinking about whether what they want is really necessary, whether it's going to make a difference to the business. But the most common thing when there's no cost attached is kind of half-baked briefs.
Right.
And that's a massive driver of inefficiency and reducer of productivity. So again, it comes down to your operating model. And I remember when BBH started, albeit an external agency, but one of the things that Nigel Bogle says about when he started BBH was that the operating model at TBWA, where the three of them were before, was not actually that good. And it was something they were determined to get into the woodwork from day one. So I would say, again, if you're thinking of setting up an in-house agency or optimizing your in-house agency, getting that operating model instilled into the way of working, instilled into the culture and the habits of the marketing function as well as the in-house agency is really important, because that will drive behavior that helps productivity in the long term.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Max, how do you see that?
Yeah, I want to add to that and make another point. I think if you commoditize a creative team and you don't assign a value to the work that they are providing, and you think it's okay to go 10 rounds on a one-slide presentation, you will lose every good person on your team and you will just churn. So you have to assign value to the work that they are creating, or it will just create a very poor feedback loop with the teams that are putting work into the onsite. The other issue that's going to cause is, when projects don't end, that's how projects sort of overlap each other. And all you're doing is ruining the credibility of that team, because then they're going to be telling other internal clients, oh, I can't take on this project or deliver it on time because I have this backlog of work that's in round 7, 8, and 9. So it's really, really important to assign value to the work. So then the question is, so how do you do that, right? And how do you keep people accountable who are abusing that internal team? And I think that's where MRM technology plays a big role. I think you need you need a tool, especially at any kind of real volume. You need a tool that handles your briefing, your approvals, and also your time management. And what we do, and I think what a lot of people do, I think, who leverage these kinds of tools, is you're basically reporting in there how many rounds you're going, how many hours you're spending on a certain kind of work. And you should be looking at the end of each month and sitting down with your internal clients and discussing with them sort of what their team's metrics are, right? And what kind of productivity they're getting out of your creative team, whether that's a production team or digital team, whatever that creative output is. It doesn't have to be conceptual creative. It could be tactical creative too. Using those tools to track time and having some sort of review cycle with internal stakeholders to sort of look at how they're performing, I think is really important.
Great. Got some great questions coming in. So I know we've got all our agreed questions, but A great one from Robert Green at Oliver. Hi, Robert. Basically, you said obviously managing and hiring freelancers on demand can be time consuming because obviously you've got the variable needs of marketing teams, you know, in terms of the workload and scopes. So how do both of you see how you can scale in-house agencies effectively? Because freelancers can be mixed results in terms of their ability. They might not be available when you use them last week. So how do you manage that variability in terms of workload and scopes?
That's a really, okay, that's a really good point. And the simple answer is for the marketing department to share their marketing calendar with the in-house agency. Now that sounds really simple and straightforward, but you'd be amazed how often that doesn't happen. So that's the kind of simple answer. A slightly more in-depth answer is obviously around the whole comms planning process and making sure that the in-house agency are in the loop on that. And again, I guess this comes back to the role of project management, because what they'll be able to do is look at a marketing calendar, look at a comms plan, and they'll be able to predict the level of demand for the projects that calendar is going to drive, and not just the level of demand overall for the in-house agency, but the kind of flavor of the demand, what type of skill is needed. So you're looking at capability as well as capacity in the in-house agency. And of course, you have to freelance for both of those. Sometimes you have to freelance for the capacity, but other times you want to do something in-house that you don't have the necessary capability for. So you can bring that in-house as well. And I guess the thing that trips in-house agencies up most here is the unpredictability of demand. And even in fast-moving, fast-changing businesses, it's possible to plan the plannable. And if you can plan the plannable, you can usually accommodate the unplannable more easily.
Plan the plannable, I like that. Max, how do you do it from the lab's point of view?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously, again, from the point of view of a company, of an agency that helps companies set up internal agencies, right? Not from the point of view of a procurement or from the point of view of a brand. But for us, this is the exact value that a mixed model has, right? We have accounts where we might have 5 or 6 people on site, but 20 people touching the work over the course of a given month, you know, and the people on site are the ones who are, like I was saying before, utilization is sort of guaranteed to be really high. And all of that load balancing, so to speak, happens behind the scenes, right? The marketing department doesn't need to spend that time. They don't need to hire a resource manager, right? These are the areas where the cost benefit of in-housing starts to, I think, disappear a little bit because, you know, once you start throwing money at freelance, you're throwing money at getting people up to speed all the time, your quality goes down, you need more producers, you need more resource managers, you need better plans, which don't exist. So that load balancing, I think, is probably the number one value add of having a third party help, because you get that pool of resource that's familiar with your brand and your process and your culture and your industry, and you basically don't have to deal with everything we're talking about.
Yeah, I think I'd just add to that bear in mind something you raised earlier, Max, one of the biggest causes of demand in-house agencies is the multiple rounds of reworking.
Yeah.
And actually, if you sort that out, then you can pretty much guarantee your freelance bill will go down.
Sure.
Thank you for that. Great question from Dave. Hi, Dave. Some great work can come from the agency and the client having contrasting views, like a collision as opposed to collusion. So is there a danger perhaps that in-house agencies can become too subservient to marketing? Can you lose the edginess? It's a really good question, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if the question is like over a period of time, can the same creative team on an account get stale? If that's sort
Yeah.
of the question, the answer is yes. That's absolutely possible after a couple years, right? There's only uh, there's only so many ways one person can think about a problem, and after a period of time, they're going to get stale. And that this goes into sort of staff planning, recruiting pipelines, and making sure that you have good up and coming talent on your within your agency, so you have fresh thinking coming in at a reasonable interval. This is the same problem, frankly, third-party agencies have when they just leave the same teams on accounts over long periods of time. And the funny thing is, a lot of clients don't like to see turnover on their accounts, which I understand, but sometimes it's actually to their benefit. Not everybody at once, but you want turnover you want a little bit of controlled turnover on your account. Because you need that fresh thinking coming through. So regardless of if you're third party or you're in-house, yeah, I think there's absolutely probably after the second year where where you're going to start to get a little bit stale thinking about the same problem over and over again.
Mm. Jim, what's your view about that
Well,
sort of rub between internal and external?
I think it's a fair point, but I guess like anything, there are two sides of the coin, and what you do get is much greater knowledge of the brand, understanding of the consumer, than you do with a team who's kind of fresh to the brief kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are pros and cons in both directions, as always. With managing creative people, it can be a bit like herding cats at times, but the art is knowing who to assign to which project, and actually making sure that within the constraints you're working in, that people get the most variety they can, because variety is a significant motivating factor. The other motivating factor that's really important in creative businesses is just the ability to go home at the end of the day feeling you've done your job well. And again, this comes back to the way you run your in-house agency, and the way your operating model works, that gives people the chance to do great work. And also, again, it's back to the culture thing we were talking about earlier. Your culture the creative culture needs to allow for people to come up with really mad ideas, and let those ideas percolate into something that is usable. And for example, in a creative environment, it's perfectly okay not to be sat at your desk all day.
Especially at the moment, if it's in your
study
or kitchen or Max's shed.
Yeah.
That's right.
No, it's really important. You might be in an organization where the culture is you're at your desk or you're in the office, but for creative people, it's really important sometimes just to get out for inspiration. And so those are the kind of things that you can do to make the best of what you've got.
And that's what we discussed in Max, weren't we? About one of the questions we had was about the view that in-house agencies can't attract quality talent. And I think, like you and Dan were saying, especially that it's like the States is so big. Like I think Dan kept referring to Kansas. I don't know why he's been watching probably lots of Wizard of Oz, but it's about how is that true that external agencies can't attract quality talent, and does sort of location make a difference as well?
Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, listen, I think in the States, people forget how big the United States are, right? The United States is huge. And there's lots of good reasons for companies not to be in and around metro areas. And there's lots of good reasons for creative folks and younger folks and developers and sort of the broader creative world to live in and around urban areas. So, it's for a lot of companies, a lot of brands, it's not about, this is just a 15-minute longer commute, or our office is less desirable. I mean, those are factors, but those are superficial factors. I think there's some more realistic factors that a lot of large companies are in towns where they're basically the only employer, or they're the largest employer, and there's a lot of career risk picking up your family and going to a place like that. All of that being said, I think the current environment, the work from home stigma going away, sort of. I mean, we'll see what happens over the next 2 years or so. The Zoom culture, which has its pros and a lot of cons. I'd rather be drinking with you guys tonight than doing what I'm doing tonight.
Yeah.
There's a lot of cons to that, especially from a creative culture and chemistry collaboration point of view. I think this is going to be challenging, but I think there's a lot of validity to location being an issue for certain kinds of work. And that has to factor in, that has to be part of the calculus for what, listen, you don't have to internalize everything, right?
Yeah.
It's, even if you could, it's not necessarily the right thing to do, right? So I think it just kind of goes back to what makes sense given a set of factors. Talent is a huge one, and kind of going from there. But yeah, I think things are going to evolve considerably as a result of COVID. I think a lot of people are going to be moving out of metro areas in the U.S. And like I said, I think Zoom and sort of these collaboration tools are going to have a lasting impact. So, it'll be interesting to see what companies who, previously had sort of butts in seats policies let happen.
Yeah. Jim?
Yeah, I think everything Max has just said is spot on. In the UK, I think it's similar but different. I think location does play a part. Not everybody wants to be in industrial estate somewhere off the M1, but actually the thing that attracts people to places of work for in-house agency folk is the chance. It goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's the chance to do good work, chance to develop your portfolio. So if you can attract people by convincing them that you have a supportive environment for people to do great work, and that's good. That comes down to job design, of course. Would people want to work in a grey metal warehouse next to a runway? Possibly not. Would they be excited about producing work for an optician? Possibly not, but maybe they think twice. But people queue up to work at Specsavers, and they don't do it because of the location. They do it because I know I can get there and get some really good work into my book. And that's a significant factor. And of course, our geography is just a tiny bit smaller than yours, Max.
Just
so
a bit.
The moving house thing is less of an issue,
I
think, in the UK, although it's always, especially if you've got a family, it's not something you
Sure.
make a decision about. But I think those are the things really that get people to move companies. And the interesting thing actually at the moment is, of course, there is an awful lot of talent, really good agency people at the moment, either looking to move or being forced to look to move due to the current situation. And I think there's real opportunity for people running in-house agencies at the moment. And I've certainly seen some very, very talented agency folk make the move to in-house agencies, both in BBC, but also in perhaps less overtly creative businesses as well. Have attracted some very strong talent, both in agency folk moving to marketing and agency folk moving to in-house agencies.
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm most interested to see as sort of a result of this situation, I agree. I think this is a great opportunity for any brand who's investing in an in-house team or continuing to invest in an in-house team. I'm very interested to see, a creative team at an agency. Creative is the work product, right? It is not a cost center. It is the revenue, right? When you're in-house, part of a marketing team, I don't know that you're looked at as the product. You're not the product, right? You're not, what you're outputting is not the primary service of the business. And I'm very interested to see, yes, of course, there's furloughs and layoffs at agencies, as there are within corporations as well. And I think people are going to look to see, our in-house agencies and marketing departments, part of the teams that are getting gutted right now. And, how are these companies treating those teams? because if they're just being looked at as cost centers, you know, they're the ones that are going to start to go first. And so, yeah, I think it's an opportunity. And I also think that there's a little bit of risk sort of associated with how companies treat their staffs right now. I think people are watching. And so I think that kind of cuts both ways.
Yeah. Another great question for Robert Green about actually the respect of in-house agencies versus external agencies, and actually how perhaps internal agencies might not have the same respect or kudos as that agency in New York, LA, London, and perhaps get landed with, I would call, you know, like tier 2 and tier 3 sort of work. You know, it's not the glossy 60-second Super Bowl John Lewis Christmas ad. It's the promotional material, the HR leaflets, tier 2, tier 3. Do you think that's valid, and how would you get around it? Jim?
Well, if I was running an in-house agency and it didn't have respect, I think it sounds kind of stupidly obvious to say this, but I'd focus on what do I need to do to win respect. And I think that regardless of the work you're doing, that all comes down to providing a service that's responsible and reliable, that the quality of whatever you're doing is really good. So people will look at it and go, oh, wow, they've made a difference. I heard somebody refer once, and they called it the colouring in department. And I just thought, oh, that's terrible. But actually, you know, I'm just thinking back, I'm inspired by a studio manager that I once worked with. And he just made sure that every single thing that left his studio was the best it could possibly be. And he won respect through that.
Yeah. I agree both with the sentiment that there, for whatever reason, I actually don't fully comprehend the reason. I think there is a stigma with in-house teams. And I agree with Jim's response on earning respect. And I think part of the challenge is that I don't think most companies are set up to have in-house agencies. I think there's a lot of sausage making that happens inside of agencies that sort of abstracts the complexity of the work and takes it off of marketing departments' plates, that in in-house situations go back onto the marketing person's plate. You know, things like resource management, things like having to write good briefs and being held accountable for you know, utilization and things like that, where more responsibility is on the customer than in a traditional sort of vendor-client relationship. That I think creates some of the stigma. So yeah, I mean, of course, doing good work over long periods of time is the best way to earn the trust of your peers. But I also think it's you know, whoever that sort of internal champion is that's setting up the agency, that sort of core senior client, I think it's also on them to set that trust up and systems up ahead of time, so people aren't abused, as Jim was saying. And so, you know, you're actually giving people the opportunity to do good work and build trust over long periods of time. I think that's a really important part of it.
Yeah, I think you touched on a really important point there about the leadership factor.
Yeah.
And the fact that it is marketing's responsibility to make it work as well as the in-house agencies.
Where do you see procurement fitting in on that, Jim?
It's really interesting. So I've worked
as
with...
it's a procurement conference, I thought I'd better ask it.
So that's a good point. So I have worked with, you know, I can think of one particular procurement person who was very engaged in the in-house agency. I hope he doesn't mind me using his name, Mike Murley's at ASOS. And actually, he made a tremendous difference because he could articulate the value of the in-house agency to the marketing department. So that's number one. Another way of answering where does procurement come in, I think it comes back to setting out what you want your in-house agency to do. And that goes all the way back to analyzing your agency portfolio against your business objectives and your business strategy. and assessing what skills do you need to deliver that business success strategy and objectives in terms of marketing. What skills do you need? Which of those skills do you feel must remain with external agencies? And which skills do you feel it might be possible to in-house? And then to pick up on something Max said earlier, it's then once you've worked out what skill, that kind of pot of skills, that bucket of skills, if you like, it's then looking at the level of demand for those skills and the kind of smoothness of demand. So if it's very peaky demand, you might decide actually it's better to let agencies deal with that on a project by project basis. But if it's relatively smooth, or you can make it relatively smooth, then you should seriously consider whether you can bring that in-house and deliver the savings and potentially more effectiveness that could result.
Mm. Max, what about you? And obviously, I think you've worked with Dan on a project or two. So where do you often work with procurement people, and do they add value, and do they ask the right questions?
Oh, well, I mean, Dan, of course he added value.
Of course, goes without saying.
Come on, what are we talking about? Of course he has. No, shout out to Dan, obviously. I think procurement can add a lot of value. Where we see the most value, I think, is in two key areas. One, just like setting up the project from the beginning to be successful, right? Like working with marketing departments to do all the things Jim is talking about. Like, what are the plans? What are the real scopes? You know, trying to work with people to kind of set the thing up, you know, from a staffing and financial perspective, to actually come in on the first day and know what to expect and earn that trust and be successful. So I think the sort of setup, the scoping and the setup piece, you know, is very important. Especially when there's, you know, we work with clients where there might be 30 brands inside of a holding company, and, you know, and the procurement person is going brands by brands by brand by brand to figure out what are the requirements, all coming into a common, you know, on-site team. That's really hard work to get right. The likelihood of that being wrong is quite high. And so that setup is really key. And then the other place where we've seen procurement play a really positive role is in making sure that there's qualitative and quantitative reviews, and that feedback is being properly given, and that a sort of evolution of the scope and the services, sort of the expectation for that is sort of built in based on how things are going. So I'd say, yeah, set up and then the, you know, on the review side is where we see most value.
And then just one quick question from John Gleeson, which I thought was quite good, about tax. How, you know, when you've got an internal agency, so we've only got 3 minutes left, is how have you seen how clients get involved in how they charge, do those costings out? You know, so, you know, it's $100, £100 this bit of work. Do procurement get involved in those cost models, the tax in, the cost of the internal agency? So,
I mean,
I've got about a minute, Jim.
Okay, thank you. In my experience, procurement haven't got involved actually in the cost at a kind of project by project level, but this goes back to the point we made earlier, point Max made earlier about attaching a value and having a kind of wooden dollars approach to the cost. So if you take the cost of running your department annually, and you divide that by the number of hours of work available, you can come up with a budget for the department, and then attach those hours either as wooden dollars or as a budget of hours to each project that comes in, and that can help you manage those costs more effectively. I don't know if that goes some way towards answering the question.
Max, how do you see it working?
Yeah, I mean, I like Jim's approach. I think you have to put a value on the time. I think when scoping, and you could do it on a sort of time and materials basis. You could do it on an output basis. I'm not a huge fan of doing it on a sort of unit economic basis. $100 for a one sheeter or something like that, $100 for a banner. I'm not a big fan of that because then you're not holding people accountable for making you do 8 rounds of work, and it just becomes reality. Yeah, I think this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, tracking time, showing people what that time is, actually having that come out of a budget, that marketing contributes to. That's where I've seen it be successful, because then everybody's in it together. If everything is just output based, I find, like we've been talking about all along, things can get out of control.
That's great. Thank you. Apologies, Dan and John, we haven't got time to answer your other questions, but thank you, Jim and Max, because we had a load of prepared questions and we've done about half of them. So thank you so much
Perfect.
for answering everybody's questions. We'd like to end up with one bit of advice for the procurement people that are watching in terms of how to manage their in-house agencies. Jim?
Okay, in terms of how to manage their in-house agencies, I think the thing they could do to really help is what we've just been talking about, because commerciality doesn't always go hand in hand with creativity, as I'm sure everybody's aware. And actually, I think there's a really valuable role that they could play in setting up that side of things.
Thank you. Max?
For me, it's just start small, build it over time. Going after 100 people like BBC, that's really incredibly ambitious. And I don't know the details of that, but that, again, very ambitious to me. Find work that's consistent. Bring in a core team, get the structure, get the technology, get the financial reporting, do a good job, build the trust, and then, move upstream and do either larger scopes or different types of scopes.
That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much for your time. Dan, do you want to sort of finish off?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to the speakers, to Tina for moderating that one. Max, Jim, really, really appreciate your time. It's been fantastic to get involved in this and all the preparation that went into it. I want to thank our attendees as well for sticking around. It's the third session of the day. We really appreciate you guys attending and asking the questions. Our hope is to see you again on Thursday. We start on Thursday morning, US time at 8 a.m. with Claire Randall, Johnny Hornby, and Charles Crisp from the ANT Partnership, talking about production in these times, which is really interesting. I'm looking forward to that session. And then you've got an hour of me and Tina, which we're expecting those numbers to dwindle a little bit. But
Prime time.
Yeah. Late night. I think we'll call that one late night, Max.
Late time.
Yeah. So we've got an hour, and we're going to talk about agency models and how they have evolved and how they continue to change, and how procurement professionals can adapt their approach to them. And then our final session is going to be on media. We've got three great speakers. We've got Stephen Abraham from OMD, we've got Chris Binns from MediaCom, and we've got Laura Nix from Empower. And we're really looking forward to that session on media and what the impact of this situation we find ourselves in has been on media across the pond in the UK and over here in the US. But until Thursday, thank you so much for your time. There will be an email coming out. The webinar was recorded. We will be releasing snippets of that and the whole piece as well over the coming weeks. And we want to thank you all and just have a great day. Take care.
Thanks everybody.
Everyone.
Take care.
Bye.